Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you're watching me. My name is Barry Lebow, and I want to take some confusion out of something called the vendor take-back mortgage. And the reason I'm posting this is because so many agents don't realize that mortgages themselves are a tool. You cannot just be in real estate and rely on a mortgage broker to help you out because you're going to be in situations where you have to be creative. Here's what we found. A lot of deals didn't close in different periods when the market went up, the market went down, and who knows what's going to be in this near future. What happens is in a buying frenzy, a buyer buys a home but has a house to sell and then can't sell their house, so they don't close. Now they're facing a major lawsuit. So that is the scenario on which I started this idea of a short video on vendor takeback. By the way, just a simple thing about semantics of language, the word vendor. In Canada, they started to use the word seller instead of vendor because some committee got together and decided vendor sounds too much like somebody that's got a convenience store or sells popcorn on the street. It's not as good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you, vendor, seller, it's exactly the same thing. So vendor take back mortgage. How old are mortgages? There are so many references. And at one point, I can't remember, I think it's Genesis, and he mortgaged his lands. They put rocks on corners and how many years and how they had to work to get the land back. It goes way back. So here's the King James version of one of them, that they have mortgaged their land. So mortgage is the concept of lending money, a private person. This is all a vendor take back is. It's a private person lending another private person money. The difference is I'm lending it against my own former home. Let's take a look at this, okay? So the idea is when I started in real estate back in 1968, you couldn't be in this industry unless you understood mortgages. We as realtors, we used to go in and say to people, how much money do you have to net to move out of this house? That was one of our most basic questions. And then by sitting there and doing math, we could figure out how to discount a mortgage, how we could get a vendor take back, discount that mortgage, and we could do these things. And it wasn't that I was specially trained, it was the norm. Any realtor that came into the business had to understand mortgages because mortgages were a tool to help us sell real estate. So I've been doing this a long time. Those of you that are in the province of Ontario, if you took the mortgage, the RIA course, Principles of Mortgage Financing, I wrote the original book on that, Principles of Mortgage Financing, while I was in my 20s. And that was one of the first courses offered to brokers. If you're in real estate and you have options, there's only two mandatory courses that you should take above when they're like mandatory. They're voluntary, but there's two that you should pursue. One is appraisal, and two is mortgage financing. And I'll tell you this, I guarantee you that today most places don't teach vendor take back mortgages. So let's look at this. Why do you use it? You use it when there are no other financing options available. It is sometimes an act of desperation between the parties. It's sometimes an act of just convenience. As a former active commercial real estate broker, in the commercial field, it is a very common thing to do because when you sell development land, the seller, the developer that had it originally, the originator, takes back a mortgage for so many years. It's common. It's very, very norm. So when do we use it here in our field? Whoops, let me move myself around here, get out of the way. Land is number one. So let's take it, you're in cottage country and you're selling some bush lots. Well, where are you going to get a mortgage? There's only one place. Either you find that odd and very odd private lender. Institutions won't touch a building lot, especially unless they're putting in huge amount of equity. But it's common for people to take back a mortgage. Isolated communities. There are communities in North America that just don't have a lot of very good lending options. So they have to deal with private mortgages, development, like I said, big developers. Now, it's also when your seller is agreeable. I'll say this to you. There are times when a savvy seller, and I'll get into that in a minute, looks at at taking back a second mortgage. It could be a third, it could be a fourth. It doesn't matter the number of the mortgage, and say, this benefits me. I'm not being forced to take it back. I want to take it back. And I'll explain in a minute or two why that's a great thing for the seller, especially a senior. And you can also do, when your buyer is short, you've got a buyer, they came up, it happened to me once. I was closing my own deal, and 3 days before closing, the lender cut back on the commitments. I had to scramble for money in 3 days to close the deal. That happened. It's not unusual. You've seen it. So you've got $1.2 million sale. Your people put down 200,000. $1 million, and all of a sudden they find out they're only getting an 850 or so mortgage at the last minute. They're scrambling. They don't have any more money, and don't have very strong family ties. And to close the deal, the vendor may have to take back the mortgage. Is that such a bad deal? Let me put this: they're getting $200,000 down equity on a property that they know their own. It's quite an interesting experience. So here's something that has kept me going in real estate, because I have a very simple mind. I always want to know what side of the net the ball is on. Seriously, I'm very serious. When I was a kid at 21, starting to sell real estate, we negotiated, and we can go back and forth 4 or 5 times with offers. And you'd sit there and you'd have to scratch out buyer, and you'd scratch out seller and put in buyer, and then seller and buyer, and back and forth. And I used to sit there and go, wait a minute, who's now sent the offer back? Which side? And I always envision the ball going over the net. Who served, who received, and who volleyed it back. And that's what it is with a vendor take back. Let me explain this. The seller lobs the ball. They serve. The seller gives it. The buyer gives, but the seller takes it back. Who is lobbing the ball? The buyer says, I need help with the financing. I want to give you an option, a mortgage option, to take back the mortgage. The ball, which side of the net? Who's on what side? That I know it sounds silly, but I'll tell you, when I'm dealing with purchaser, buyer, purchaser, I really sometimes, this is what keeps my mind in track. I'm a visual type of person. Now, the typical terms of a VTB. In your APS, in your agreement, okay, the wording is the buyer gives the lobby over the net, and the seller shall receive the amount of X dollars as a second. Now, doesn't have to be a second mortgage, it could be a third mortgage, a fourth, it could be a first mortgage. And then you go into the terms of the mortgage. It can be a long-term. In land deals, it could be up to 7 years for big development land. But in many cases, if you're just doing it in interim to help people get over a hump to buy, it could be as short as 6 months. The last one I arranged recently was 6 months. It should never exceed the maturity of the first. So if you're taking back, your client's taking back a second mortgage that comes due December 31st of this year, your mortgage should not come due. It should become due, let's say December 30th, always before the maturity date of the first. I won't get into law and everything, but there's a chance that if it's not done, then the second becomes the first. It's a nightmare. I don't want to get into that. You can take back any number of mortgage. You can take back a first mortgage, a second mortgage, third. I've seen fifth mortgages. It doesn't matter how many mortgages. As a matter of fact, you can even break up the mortgage into how you take it back. I had a case in a cottage country. They took back a 90% mortgage. They were desperate to sell. And it was the stupidest thing I've ever seen. The agent understood the concept of a vendor take back, but there's a 90% mortgage on the property. What the agent should have done is taken back the 90%, but broke it between a first mortgage and a second mortgage. The first mortgage being maybe 60, 65%. You're going to say, but why? What's the difference? The difference is if the seller, the vendor of the property needed to get cash, they could go and borrow against the mortgage. They could sell the mortgage. No one wants to buy a 90% mortgage. But if it was split up between 65 and 35, then they could sell off part of the mortgage, 65%, because there's a lot of equity at that point. But I'm not buying as an investor. I would not buy somebody's 90% mortgage. Does that make sense? That was a stupid thing on the agent's part. It was smart to take back the mortgage. It was stupid not to break it in two. All right, or 2/3, 1/3, whatever. Interest rates. Now, if you do not do amortization in these. Please do not do amortization. It's interest only. There should be no payments for short term. In other words, if you're doing a deal where it's a vendor take back to help people through a hump because they need 3 months, 6 months or something, come on, you're making a deal. I don't even charge them interest at that point. Just a second. If they don't pay by the end of 6 months, then interest starts to occur. While the first 6 months, I give them a bonus. It's gratis. Okay. The interest rates are higher. If there is an interest rate, it could be 8%, 18%. My last one was 6%. Why 6? Because I wanted to make it attractive for everybody and show cooperation. And by the way, 6% is a lot better than what my client, the seller, was getting at the bank. So it's still not a bad deal. The borrower pays the legal costs of registering the mortgage. So if I lend $100,000, I don't have $100,000 less my legal fees as the lender. The borrower pays it. My 100 goes out as full investment. And obviously, I'm taking back on this house. There's no appraisal needed because we've just negotiated the deals. There's no appraisal. So let's look at a deal that doesn't close. Let's look at this, okay? We have a deal that doesn't close, and it's $1.2 million sale price. Some of you live in different parts of the country. You don't have $1.2 million, but please bear with me. Buyer has arranged a new first mortgage of $900,000. The buyer's deposit on the deal is $75,000. So far, traditional, no problem. They did not close. They have a house. They can't sell their house. So the first thing they're going to have is forfeit $75,000 once it goes through all the litigation, of course. And that money is going to be sitting in limbo for quite a long time. The seller, they go through all kinds of legal stuff. The seller gives them one more chance and then relists the house. The market shifted a bit and they can only sell it for $1 million flat, less commission. They now have lost $200,000 from the first offer. So they're suing the buyer for the difference of $1.2 million to $1,200,000. They're suing the buyer for the cost of carrying. They're suing the buyer for legal fees, all kinds of costs. Now the buyer in turn needs a lawyer to defend it. Their $75,000 is now going to add another $100,000 of legals. And by the time this is all over, the courts could rule you owe the buyer. They could say to the buyer years later, and years will go by. They could say to the buyer years later, hey, you're on the hook for $300,000 or more. Why would you risk all that money, 4 or 5 years of your life, when there are simpler solutions to make this deal happen? This is not an impossible deal. This is the scenario I was faced with recently here in Toronto. And this is what I did with my people. Okay, we're going to look at this. So if we have a seller who has to list at a lower price, they have a measured loss, they claim legal fees. What if these people, though, what if the people who had sold their house had also gone out and bought another house themselves? What happens then? You've got a real situation on your hands because now there's 3 deals involved. I mean, there could be a chain of events, what this person bought and this person bought, who bought, who bought. It can go on and on. The court case is 5 to 7 years. The buyer's deposit is held in escrow in the courts. And not only that, we as realtors, we've lost our commission for a lot of work and aggravation. And then if you're the listing agent, you know what, Barry, you didn't do a good enough job. You should have known this guy couldn't close the deal. We're giving it to somebody else. So I don't even get a chance to relist this property unless I've got a reasonable seller. And in a lot of cases, they're not reasonable. They're angry, and their anger is going to be directed at who's ever standing in front of them. So let's look at it my way. You've got the same scenario, and you've got a deal gone south. It's not closing because the buyer can't sell their house. So here's what you do. I sit down and I show them numbers of what it's going to cost them and the amount of years. This is the seller now. I'm the listing agent. I'm going to show them how much it's going to cost to pursue this. And then after they absorb it all, I say, do you really want to go down this road and make lawyers rich? Do you? I mean, lawyers not rich, but they're going to do their job. And you have to pay them for that job. They're not cheap. Now, what if you win this case 4 or 5 years later and the buyer just goes bankrupt? What are you going to do? What if the buyer leaves the country? You know, what are you going to do? You'll get the deposit, but won't cover your fees. Common sense has to prevail. The trouble with common sense is, we all know, I remember common sense in my youth. You don't see a lot of common sense today. People are so angry all the time. You will need cooperation from the other side. So the first thing I do, I pick up the phone, I speak to the agent, the buyer's agent. I say, do you want to solve this? Well, what do you think they're going to tell me? Of course they do. I need your permission to speak to your client, because I can't call directly. And they go, well, sure. I said, here's what we can do. I actually am prepared. I want to go to see their house. Why don't we meet at their house? Because I have to see the house. It's part of the process. I have to see the house they have to sell. And I go to the buyer and I say to them, I give them the same thing. Here's all the math and here's where you can go. And the worst case scenario, you go bankrupt. What do you want to do? And they'll look at you and I don't know. And they're so confused. And you suggest that I can solve this problem. So you say, if I could save you a small amount, if I could cost you a small amount of money, and instead of losing hundreds of thousands, saving you in the process, would you be interested in a solution? Well, common sense. Most people would say yes. I have some stubborn people who just you can't deal with. Okay. So you suggest the buyer goes forward to close the deal. I say to the buyer, you put up 75,000 or 65,000, whatever it is. Give me another, you got a little more money, top it up to $100,000. They add another 35 to their 65. I think my example said 75 a minute ago, but it doesn't matter. They're now topping at 100,000. I go back to the seller and I go, look, they're the good faith. I've been to their house. I looked at their house. It's a nice house. I would take you over to their house and show it to you if you want to see, because it's important to this. I actually had 2 brothers I was working with as sellers for their mother's estate. I took them to the buyer's house. They walked out overly impressed with 2 things. The house showed beautifully, and the buyer was a very nice person, trapped. The house was well priced. There was nothing wrong with the house, but there were 13 houses in that immediate neighborhood for sale at exactly the same time. We finally convinced that particular buyer, he was a seller of that house, his own house, to reduce a little bit. There's an old saying in real estate, you can be in the market, on the market, or ahead of the market. On the market, price it anything you want. In the market means you're competing with these 13 houses. Ahead of the market, if every house in the subdivision was asking from $1.2 million to $1.4 million, then you got to be $1,150,000. That's ahead of the market. And so the seller in my case took back $200,000 better take back for 6 months, no payments. And what happened? The buyer sold their house 3 months later, paid everybody off, and that was it. So let's look at the mathematics of this. In other words, in what just happened here, hundreds of thousands of dollars were not forfeited, and 4 or 5 years of lawsuits were negated. It was just logic. So the mortgage helped bridge, make a deal, vendor take back, whatever you want to talk about. It doesn't matter. It is a tool used to help make this action happen so that you don't walk around screaming, oh my God, my deal's falling apart. What am I going to do? What are you going to do? You're going to take control. Napoleon Hill, the famous Napoleon Hill said, it's always your next move. Unless you got terminal cancer, everything's got a solution. And that's how real estate should be. There's always a move. So yes, for the buyer, they're carrying 2 houses. Yes, they got 2 first mortgages. They got the mortgage on their own house plus the new house. I worked at about $4,000 a month. They got to pay tax, insurance, and utilities on the new house. 3 months, they've now paid $12,000 just in mortgage. Taxes, everything, utilities, it's an expensive taxer. $4,000, I figured. Total $16,000. Then we've got, in this case, I said there's 6% interest. That was 6% interest at the end of 6 months. If they couldn't pay it off, then interest was going to say, well, we didn't have interest here. So I'm going to round it off. It was about $20,000. It was under $20,000 the buyer lost. The buyer lost about $20,000, 18.9, I think it was 18.5 at the end. Lawyers were satisfied, the deal's closed, my client moved on, everybody was happy. There was no loss here. What did I do for the buyer? I had to save that buyer, who wasn't my client, hundreds of thousands of dollars and the potential in years to come to be bankrupt, because they couldn't afford to pay a lawsuit of losing hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars and living under the misery. Those of you that have had high debt on you, you know it's like 1,000 pounds on your head weighing on you. You don't want to go through that. So they're a win. So here's the pitfalls. The first mortgage lender, the A lender, may say, I don't want a second mortgage registered behind it. A lot of government insured mortgages say you can't have a second mortgage. You have to check with that. What happens if they don't sell their house within, say, 3, 4, or 5 months? For the seller, the seller has to look that, well, there's $100,000 now in the pot for the down payment's been increased. But what happens in years to come if I have to sue and get that 100's not going to go very far against all my losses, but at least it's there. The seller, if the people buy the property, take back a second mortgage, they take back a second mortgage. For the seller, who now becomes the mortgagee or the mortgage lender, they have to look at, if the people default in any way, then I have to power of sale them, foreclose on them, and I've got added legal costs. Yes, there's pitfalls. It's not all perfect, okay? Seller advantage. I'm a senior and I'm selling, and I specialize in seniors, and I've said to many seniors, what are you gonna do with your money? And I shudder. What do you mean you're putting it into the bank? You're going to get nothing. They won't even give you, a clock radio. I mean, they're giving you nothing. No, I don't take risk. Risk, if inflation is 4 or 5% right now, it's probably over 5.5 right now, and you're getting point something percent, less than 1% at the bank, you're losing money. I can't get through some of their heads. And I realized something with seniors. If they weren't investors when they were young, they're not going to become investors when they're old. But I sometimes have savvy seniors who say, I can't get enough return. I want security. What investment, what investment do seniors know better than any other who are homeowners? Their own home. So they know the security, it's their own house. Nobody knows it better than they do. They've been there 40 years. So a young couple comes along, they've only got 200,000 down, but maybe 150, and they really want the house. I can say to the senior, take back a mortgage, get a reasonable return on your investment, and you become the mortgage lender, and you get a lot better return than you will on a GIC. Does that work with all my seniors? And the answer is no. Only those who are savvy investors look at this. I have given up trying to tell seniors, older seniors, how to invest their money. I just don't even tell them, let me bring you in a financial expert or anything. I stop. They just don't listen. It's impossible, because even today, a safe stuff, you can get 5% today on your money without having to take back a mortgage. So there's a lot of reasons, but for a senior, it's a great tool. VTB tips, okay? Never amortize these. And let me explain why. You lend $10,000. I give you back every month $20. I take $20 of principal away from your 10 every month when I do an amortized mortgage. You haven't got a return on the full 10,000 because I'm eating away, giving you back principal. No, I give you 10,000. I want interest on 10,000. Period. So it's interest only. It's the only way to lend for these things. Never allow for fully open. Let me explain. If I lend my money and I'm comfortable now, for the one where I'm bridging, where the person has to sell and then buy, yeah, that's a different story. I would do anything, make the deal, doesn't matter. But if somebody was taking it back because they wanted the investment in a vendor take back, why would it be just open? Then all of a sudden I get my money back. What am I going to do with it? So number one, if you're going to have a prepayment clause, it has to be in increments of $1,000. So you can pay $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $10,000, but you can't pay $95 and you can't pay $995. Why? Because I can reinvest instruments of $1,000, but I can't invest $95. You know what I'm saying? Number two, I also want that if you do pay it all out, I want 3 months penalty. I want 3 months of interest. Why? Because I need time to replace and find another investment to put my money. So I need that. I also say that they have, another thing I usually do, and I forgot to put it on the slide, is they have to give me 90 days notice that they're going to pay me out if I'm holding the mortgage. Okay. Again, I want to figure out, what am I going to do with the money now if I'm a mortgage lender? So here's my disclaimer. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just someone that's been around. And I understand this stuff because I've done vendor takebacks. It's just normal part of what I've done my entire career. Do not get involved in this unless you have the lawyers, the real estate lawyers involved in this deal, that everybody's on side. You need cooperation of them and the other broker. And sometimes you'll have to look. In Canada with CMHC, they may not allow a second mortgage behind one of their firsts. And that could be a bit of a problem. And then you'd have to go further and get rid of the CMHC mortgage, go to a B lender. It's a real mess. So here's where I finish. I want you to really understand something, folks. If you don't understand mortgages as a tool, you are shorting yourself in your real estate career. You have to understand the basics of the mortgage industry. Vendor takebacks are a great tool. Now I've got my Facebook professional page is Ask Barry Lebow. I'd love you to join me there, where I talk about agency and stuff like this. YouTube, subscribe to Barry Lebow TV. Go look at my TV. There's stuff on there that you may find of interest. Here's my contact information. I thank you very much for listening. If you want to reach out to me for anything, please do. But please, I'm not your manager. I'm not your broker. I have so many agents phoning me for stuff. Guys, why did you go to the brokerage you're in if you don't have a good broker or manager to answer your questions? I'm not going to do that. Honestly, ask me legitimate questions that's beyond the scope of your broker. I'll be happy to. But if you ask me questions that a normal broker or manager should be answering, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that. So, but that's, what can I say? Also, give me suggestions of what you want to learn more about, and I'll be very, very happy to do a video on it. I hope you've learned something here. I hope you had some takeaways, and I hope we can get some comments going. And I hope I didn't make any errors in anything I said outside of that $75,000 down. Thank you. Good hunting, and it's a great career. I hope you have a longevity in this business because it's been damn good to me. Barry Lebow saying goodbye.